We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
This issue of aid, foreign aid, is not something new that's being discussed in the so-called developing world. It's actually rather old. But it got a lot of attention over the last 15 years as people began to collect the data and understand that a lot of foreign aid was tied. It was, in fact, a form of neo-colonial imperialism, and that it had to be changed. The recent move by the US government and some of the European governments to stop foreign aid, partly driven by the fact that they realize they don't have the money, and secondly, driven by concerns about perpetuating dependency as well, has brought this to the fore. The efforts by the US new administration, particularly to reduce spending, in a good way, exposed much of the excesses of aid agencies in the US, like USAID. That triggered responses from Africa. But what was interesting was to see certain African leaders actually say this is a good thing because it would force a rethink about how they view development. Now, my own experience, having been someone who worked in Africa, albeit as a volunteer, but in a way also part of the aid industry, as I call it, taught me a lot of lessons too. And I went there. I was naive but adventurous, wanted to go to Africa, work in the development sector, particularly in rural water supply and sanitation. I was, even at that stage in my life, really quite shocked by the excesses of the way the aid agencies operated and the wastage and the reinforcement of very old archaic imperial views and the political ties that aid reinforced. And we've seen this now play out in the last 30 years since I left Africa. I left after 4.5 years because I realized that I was in fact part of that system and perpetuating it, though I was a very small, low-level worker in the field, building toilets, water supply systems, and sanitation. About 15 years ago, I think she's Ghanaian, a Ghanaian author, Nambisa Moyo, wrote a very sort of seminal book called Dead Aid. And for an African woman who is although Western educated, calling it all out was that time a trigger for rethink. She got a lot of pushback, but it laid the foundations for thinking about it. But prior to her book, other African leaders had already talked about this need to cut ties with the dependency that this was creating. One was the Ghanaian first Prime Minister, Nkrumah, who wrote a very important book, which I urge everyone to read, called Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stages of Imperialism, where he really started laying out the need to go through the pain and create independence. And I think one of the best lines in his book, if I remember right, I have it written down here, was, "We rather prefer self-governance with danger than servitude in tranquility." It was this cry for independence, the search for solutions that are their own. And this is today what is happening in Africa, which I think is a very good thing. I was part of the system, but I was not highly paid. Thank God for that. I went as a volunteer. I was in a stipend of $100 per month at that stage. But even then, I felt I was living a life of privilege, although $100 because I had access to all the sort of more elite networks and all of that. Because somehow that aid industry brings you all together. You're all part of those foreigners who are trying to help those people. I like to think that I contributed because I did physical work. I laid down pipes, built springs, and I even helped build the first water quality testing laboratory in the country where I was in. But I was highly uncomfortable, even with some of the volunteers that were part of the organization I was part, I belonged to, the lifestyles they all led. It was one of, constant travel because there was no supervision, going to safaris and all of this stuff. And as someone coming from Asia, I found this sort of voyeurism, if you want to call it, very off-putting. And so I did my work. I had another life when I was there, which is I played music in a band. So I was very immersed in the local environment. I suspect everyone else would say the same thing. But what was most interesting to me was how the more highly senior people who were part of this industry, who were sent by USA, the UK government, the Germans, the Canadians, lived lives of such excessive privileges, wholly unnecessary. These people were, I think, good professionals, but they were paid in a ways that, as they say, if you get paid in these ways, what my experience is, it corrupts you, it softens you eventually. So there were the consultants, the real estate agents, the hospitality people, and then there were the locals who wanted part of that as well. So you created an elite of locals who, rather than becoming part of building their own country, were essentially supporters of the system because they fed off it. So I saw a lot of the best cream of the locals essentially becoming part of, and I will say on the outset, I mean, the UN is a very important organization, the World Bank is, but they all became part of this. And I think the system and the US aid, UK foreign aid, essentially created a system that was, and it's a powerful word to use, but corrupt on more levels than just the transfer and exchange of money. I think it corrupts the mind, also good people, and you get used to it. People just keep renewing their contracts because schooling for your kids is paid. You live in a large house you could never afford at home with three maids, gardens, and you have memberships in the best clubs, etc. So fast forward, and even in Malaysia today, there are UN officials who work for the World Bank, etc., who have lived in places that even the most wealthy Malaysians could not afford. But in 2025, you can go around Southeast Asia and you can see the same old thing. But in Malaysia, I know that there are international multilateral agency officials who live lifestyles that very few in this country can afford. And I think it's a shame, this sort of display of exclusivity doesn't belong to the world of development. And therein lies a problem. And I believe that, the current World Bank president, etc., are aware of this. But dismantling something like this is rather difficult. I mean, who would say that a placement in Malaysia is a hardship placement? Come on. Placement in Malaysia would be something where you take a salary reduction to come and live in a place like Malaysia, or for that matter, anywhere in Southeast Asia. So those are the things that I think it's so archaic. They belong to the 20th century. The 21st century, we need to dismantle this. And in a strange way, this current U.S. administration has shed light on an abuse, a lot of money being wasted, and that needs to be challenged, and that money needs to be spent better on the causes that these agencies are meant to try and rectify. It's not just Africa, it's Southeast Asia, it's the Middle East. Many of these countries have suffered from bad leadership. Bad leadership is not something that somehow, we only see in the poorer countries. But when poor countries coming out of a decolonization period of, 100 years or 200 years, don't have very strong leadership, then the problems are exaggerated, can't be fixed. When an imperial power has bad leadership, the consequences are not so dire because they have that historical accumulation of wealth, they still have the global influence, and those nations can tolerate bad leadership, as we are seeing in many parts of Europe, etc. But the decline is slower. But when you're so poor, you need to change quickly. There are many great examples of leaders who essentially got to grips with the challenge and reformed. And a place close to home would be Singapore. It'd be also fair to say that in Malaysia, we had good leadership in the post-colonial era, people who had a vision, a dream, and help. So it didn't suffer from the lack of leadership to transform from a colonial era into a different era. South Africa is a good example of a leader who had a vision, Nelson Mandela. But then he was followed by people who are not as strong. And there are many reasons for that. And I believe South Africa will recover from that. So you need political will and you need leadership. Then you need to understand that there are some things you have to change and you have to be tough. And I discussed this in my book on the sustainable state. I also talk about it in my book on dismantling global white privilege, particularly with regard to how international aid works, and particularly how it's all tied and the power of the old world to punish you if you take steps that are seen to be either undemocratic and doesn't fit in with Western liberal narratives. And this is where aid is often tied. And governments are put under huge pressure to conform, to perpetuate a neo-colonial economic order. So that's the critical ingredient. Then you have to think about, okay, what are we going to do? And there lies reforms, lots of reforms, but you need strong political leadership. If you have those, then the opportunities are multitude. You start writing the rules, and there are great examples in Africa too now. Rwanda is a good example. Now, the Rwandan experience is clear in terms of the economics, but its political structures do not fit in with the Western neoliberal definition of what is good governance. Neither did Lee Kuan Yew in his early years. He was seen as a dictator, etc. So there are many examples, and that shift in the early days is tough because typically you're quite small. You've taken the mantle of leadership, you've got the political will, and now you're starting to enforce ways of governance that do not suit the liberal, neoliberal aid, so that we want democracy, open markets, etc., to perpetuate the old order. So you have to take a lot of hits. Not everyone can cope with that. Some of them succumb in their countries. There's intervention from foreign forces to undermine that process because it undermines access to resources, particularly in Africa, Asia. But the options are multitude. And I'll just say two things. The first one is intercontinent trade, opening up that. But for that, you need infrastructure. So you need to start. But building that. And it's very interesting that, despite being 100 years, hundreds of years of European colonization in Africa and also in Asia, the infrastructure is very bad. Now, Africa is starting to build it. But guess who's helping Africa build some of that infrastructure? China. This is not well received. Now, China will have to make sure it behaves itself and is not seen as a neo-imperial. But the news from Africa is welcoming the Chinese. I'm sure the Chinese are driven by self-interest, but the Africans are also driven by, okay, you come, invest, and these are the deals we will make. So we will see how that progresses. But trade within is very important. Foreign direct investment, which is not excessive or exploitative, is also very important. And then the government needs to essentially the governments need to look at self-sufficiency. And very important that is building institutions, which are very strong, education, healthcare. And there are many examples on how this could be done. But there's no substitute for the ideological shift rooted in the political will to create independence and self-sufficiency. and provide the people with the dignity, which is what I saw was the most important thing. People lost their dignity because they were always told somebody else has your interest and will help you. And which is why, I realized that even though I was a low level water sanitation engineer, this is not the game I wanted to be part of. Thank you.